Let's get started. And I will give the floor to Carol and Scott with a huge experience. And we had a very, very good talks before you take over. And give her the floor. Carol and Scott.
Thank you, Michael. Most importantly, can you hear me? Okay, that's great. Thank you. For those of you who I haven't met so far, as Michael said, my name is Carol Ann, and I'm the chair of ICOM-IMREC, which is a new partnership between ICOM and Shanghai University. But today, I just want to go back to something that Kristen said on the very first day of this conference. She said, we are all connected by the sea. And today's theme is people and the sea. And in the course of the next several hours, we're going to hear about a lot of voices, and particularly about the range, the diversity, and the impacts of those connections. Some of those voices have been forgotten, some of them have been more consciously overlooked. But these are stories that affect us all and that we really have to come to terms with within our field. And it happens at a time when museums are being charged with being more socially relevant, more inclusive, and more responsive. So I think we're, as a sector as a whole, museums as a whole, and maritime museums in particular, we're on a journey. And in many ways, what we will hear today are signposts on that journey. And I can't think of a better way to start than to introduce our keynote speaker, Wayne Modeste. Wayne is originally from Jamaica. He is now the director of content at the National Museum of World Cultures, which has 4 campuses in the Netherlands. And he's also a professor of material culture and critical heritage studies at university here in the Netherlands. Wayne's research interest is really colonization and its afterlives, and particularly the social justice imperative for museums to come to terms with decolonization. Today, Wayne is going to talk to us about memory, and particularly the role of both the sea and museums as an archive of memory for enslaved peoples. Please welcome Wayne Modeste.
Thank you. I said earlier to Michael that you get invited to do something and you say yes, and then you think, why did I do this now? So that's where I am at this point. Why did I do this? However, let's hope and see what happens. First, I want to acknowledge you all and thank you for coming to listen to me this morning. I also want to say that I am critical, so it is going to be critical. But my critique is not intended for you. My critique is very often intended for me and our own institutions. So Carol said, my name is Wayne, and I'm from Jamaica. And I was going to start out with, this is what I'm supposed to do, but you don't have to read it, it's a lot. I was going to start out with playing something, but as an old person as I am, I cannot remember how to embed things in a PowerPoint. So it's good though, because then I will do something else. Limbo, limbo like me, limbo, limbo, limbo like me. And the limbo stick is the silence in front of me. Limbo, limbo like me, limbo, limbo, limbo like me. Long dark nights is the silence in front of me. Limbo, limbo, limbo like me. Stick hits sound and the ship like it's ready. Stick hits sound and the ship still steady. Limbo, limbo, limbo like me. Long dark decks and the water surrounding me. Long dark deck and the silence is over me. That is from Kamau Brathwaite. And the other, where are your monuments, he says, your battles, your martyrs? Where is your tribal memory, sir? In the grave vault, in the sea. The sea has locked them up. The sea is history. I begin with these 2 poems by 2 of my own literary heroes of the Caribbean, and as an entryway into what I want to discuss this morning: the sea, the ocean, the oceanic. The first is from Nobel laureate Derek Walcott, and the second from the Barbadian Kamau Brathwaite. Both authors invite us to think the sea differently, to think otherwise about the ocean. And yet, I'll come back to this later, but contrary to what happens when a Jamaican comes on stage, and Carol, thank you for announcing my Jamaicanness, it's good for me, I cannot run. I am not Usain Bolt, so one disappointment there. The second is, I'm not Bob Marley. They always ask me that because of my dreads, so that doesn't work either. But shamefully enough, I can't swim. And that always does something for people. They say, but you're from an island. Yes, it is true. This is contradictory. But for those of you who know me, and I know a little bit about parts of the Caribbean, we grew up with a healthy fear of the sea. One could describe it as dread. And I have a son, he's 9 years old, and he tells me every day, Daddy, I have my A, B, and C diploma, and you have none. You can't swim, Daddy. It was something that was inculcated in me, actually, by my mother. I have often said jokingly that as a school child, when we were going to the beach on a school trip, just before the trip, my mother would give me a spanking. And the spanking was, don't go to the sea. Don't go into the water. It was a forewarning for the spanking that would come after if you did go into the sea. It was my mother's dread that perhaps inhabits me. So perhaps I was the wrong person to ask to be a part of this conference. But notwithstanding, I'm going to do something else. And this morning, what I want to do is to think through that fear and dread of my mother as a starting point to think about how we as museums, how we as maritime museums might reorient ourselves to thinking differently about water and about life. I'm going to rest my thoughts on a few black feminist scholars and Caribbean thinkers who have think about the question of decolonization, even if they've not called it like that. For me, my presentation is a presentation of hope, actually, because I see decolonization as hope, as joy, as dancing. I take a framework of decolonization, not one of anxiety, which is often taken by many institutions when they hear the word, but rather as the way decolonization might have looked for Jamaica in 1962, as a future, as a different kind of future. Decolonization as freedom. First, I want to talk to you a little bit about what I call decolonization as infrastructure. And that is my limbo, like me. I wanted to do that because, you know. But what I'll do later on is to reorient you to think another kind of thinking about decolonization. We refuse to be what you wanted us to be. Bob Marley says, we are what we are. That's the way it's going to be. He invites us to rebel the structures that continue to dominate. If decolonization is to be a systemic shift in the way we operate as museums, if it is to be more than a fad that we want to get rid of, a fashionable thing, or what Eve, Tuck, and Yang have described as a metaphor, then we must demand that decolonization involves an infrastructural change. Significant shifts in both the epistemic, the knowledge systems, and the physical infrastructure that characterizes our institutions. Indeed, as the concept whose force was increasingly felt in museum world in about the middle of the second decade of the 21st century, pushed largely by activists outside the museum, inside the museum, it has been received sometimes with fear, with anger, sometimes with impatience. I've heard people say, okay, can't we stop now? Yeah, aren't we decolonized yet? With skepticism and with denialism. Funnily enough, my museum is actually called, I said that to Carol, the World Museum, and there was an article that called us the Woke Museum. I felt that was, I don't know if everybody felt it, but I felt that was a compliment. That said, decolonization has been taken up by museums, even if we've felt anxiety and uncertainty. Decolonization has been taken up as a replacement for diversity and inclusion. Sometimes I would suggest forgetting the equity work that is a part of the practice or the project. For us at the World Museum, decolonization we could describe as an operation in worlding that would question the very foundation on which we were built as an organization. It was an operation in thinking again about what anthropology meant, who was going to be anthropologized and who not. But it was also a question about who was in the art museums, which art histories, and who was not in the art museum. It was a way of thinking about why is it so that indigenous peoples from Australia or North America are often regarded within certain museums as out of time, actually very often as not of the contemporary. I was excited to go to the Venice Biennale recently and seeing the work, the winning pavilion, which was Australia, which was an absolutely brilliant showing of how we might engage with colonial histories and its afterlives in the present. Decolonization for us in our museum was a revaluing of life and a thinking about flourishing, the flourishing of diversity. It was not about celebrating diversity. For us in our museum, we actually are a little bit shunned that idea of celebration. I often take it to myself to suggest that please don't celebrate me. I'm okay to just be. Let me be. Celebration for me, and that's because I'm a little anxious about museums that fashion themselves around pride as a narrative. What objects were regarded as anthropological was a question that we would want to ask. Where was design? Where was fashion? Where is art? And can we think of art also outside of Western centers? But decolonization was also for us a temporal thing, a thinking about how we live with time and whose time is important. I've always been fascinated by the idea of Columbus's discovery of the Caribbean, of the New World. What does that moment mean when there was a moment prior to that moment? Or, if we were to take the US as an example, what does it mean when the founding of the nation might go back to a time after indigenous life and life worlds? So decolonization then is for us to think temporally about who lives in the present, who is contemporary, and where is contemporary. As an infrastructure, I give the joke all the time, and I will do it here again, that when I was in Jamaica and I woke up in the morning, every morning I failed ICOM's requirements for preservation. I couldn't understand it, that I wake up and it was a haunting for me because I could never get the temperature to go down beyond 20 degrees. It was just impossible for me. And the air conditioning units would cost me more than I could afford. But then, when I woke up as well, the relative humidity was already 90%. So I was already failing there as well. So in a sense, decolonization for me is not simply a question of diversity doing. It is a question of what is the intellectual infrastructure on which we are based as institutions. What is the infrastructure of the Maritime Museum? What histories do we tell? What stories, and from whose perspectives? And in a funny way, this is not a maritime issue, perhaps not, but I've always thought it's interesting. And these are some of the images of decolonized displays. These are in the US, but it has happened all over. And I include in my thinking about decolonization, Roads Must Fall, that happened in South Africa, but then went to the UK. But one of the interesting things for me in this movement and the movement towards questions of restitution is the fact that, Carol, at the moment that I left London 10 years ago, I couldn't go back there because I needed a visa. Who has the right to move? And who moves easily? And I'd love to think with ICOM about this. In the geography of what ICOM is, who has the right to move and who not? And who do we have to support with letters and this and that so that they can travel where others find it hard to travel? So decolonization for us is also restitution. It is also thinking about the fact that if somebody from Jamaica wanted to go to the Netherlands to see a Taino sculpture that came from the Netherlands, they would need a visa. If somebody from the Netherlands wanted to go to Jamaica to see anything, they would just need a ticket and flip-flops, because it's warm. Decolonization is about the very infrastructure that organizes the way we are as institutions. And it is not simply around questions of race and racialization. It is about questions of gender and ableism. It is about questions of who can read text or not read text. It is about questions of how we simply understand the world as a hierarchy of who belongs and who does not belong. It is not tick boxing where we get more people of color or more diverse gendered people. Decolonization for us at my museum is creating the conditions where those people can flourish and flourish well. And by that I mean, I don't know how many of you want to put up your hands, you don't have to, but by that I mean, it might be much easier in England, probably difficult here, might be much easier in England for us to get a diverse staff at the V&A. There are a lot of black British people, a lot of people from everywhere. It might be much harder to keep them there without them going mad, because all of the issues are framed in a way that says their belonging is something that must be questioned or must be celebrated. But that is on decolonization. What I want to end with in my cautionary note to think about the question of decolonization is, however, is the cautionary note that some would want to put into the decolonization trajectory to say that it is a demolition or a criticism or a breaking down of Western intellectual traditions. That it's a destruction of the West. That it says everything born here is wrong. That is not what decolonization is. On my part, anyway, I still look to Locke when I think about the question of property. However, I want some other thinkers from other parts of the world who are interested to critique Locke about his understanding of what property looks like. And there's a wonderful philosopher called Charles Mills who wrote a book called The Racial Contract, where he thought about what it might mean to think about philosophy when racism is closely entangled with it. And one of the questions that we must ask in that is, who was the ideal man? And I say man when much of our philosophers were developing their thoughts on philosophy. It was not a person of color, not normally. So I draw my thinking from the Caribbean and Caribbean thought to ask the question to you this morning: what might a maritime history look like differently if we were to take decolonization seriously? What are the different epistemic formations that we would have to think through and think with to be able to reorder our knowledge and understanding of the question of the maritime? And I came with the idea of the sea. with Caribbean thought, several scholars have thought through the sea. I opened with Derek Walcott and Kamau Brathwaite, but scholars such as Edouard Glissant, the sea is an important part of thinking about the question of relationality, how we are intimately bound up with each other, that my identity is not without yours. He thinks also about the question of the archipelago and the archipelagic. And I think it was Michael earlier who spoke a little bit about the idea that one of the things that we need to think about is not the sea as divide, but the sea as connection. And that is what both Walcott as well as Glissant were thinking about. The sea not as a space of border, but actually as a horizon of being together, sharing histories together. Within this framework, the sea is an archive. The Caribbean for Glissant is a floating, free, not fixed in one position in some primordial spot, but extending in all directions in our world through its networks and its branches. The sea as archive is connectivity, is relationality. The sea is the sedimentary site of memory. For Walcott, in the poem from which this talk has taken the name, the sea is a site for Caribbean monuments. Walcott has been struggling with, like many Caribbean people have been struggling with, what they call the absence of ruins. What does it mean when you cannot have the monumental statues and the big great houses and all of those things that are in Europe? What does it mean to have a ruination that isn't monumental, but is in the land, in the soil, and in the sea? How do we remember those monuments that we don't often see? And what does it mean for us to think again about the monumental tradition? So Walcott says, where are your monuments, your battles, your martyrs? Where is your tribal memory, sirs, he says. He suggests that the sea is where those histories are embodied. And this for Walcott, like many people of the Caribbean, in the Caribbean, me as well, even though I can't swim, I like to stand and look out and think about it, right? So I go to the sea for that. The question is precisely that. How do we find memories of a history that very often has been elided, erased, especially in monumental institutions like these? The sea is history. The sea is our monuments. But I wanted to start with that idea of limbo for you. Also because you're going to be here for a long day, you've been here for 6 days, and to be honest, limbo is just so nice to see. So when you go back, you need to play that song, Limbo, Limbo, Limbo like me. Just play it and laugh with it. But Kamau Brathwaite invites us to do something else when he talks about limbo. For this Barbadian, limbo is not about the dance. Because for Brathwaite, the limbo dance, and I can't do it. I'm 50, so I'm more than 50, so doing that don't work anymore. But for Brathwaite, the limbo dance begun in the hold of the slave ship. The idea of how to bend and contort yourself was one of the only ways of survival in the hold of the ship. But limbo is also the memory of an Africa forgotten. It is a memory of a history of sounds. And so he speaks about the sticks. And Brathwaite's, all of his poems are written with sound. So he sings his poetry. And that's why, da 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 da, that is the sound of the drum and the sticks on the drum as he recalls ancestral memories in the slave ship and on the shores in the Caribbean. Where are these ancestral sounds? Where are these memories? In which museums do we find these stories? But if Brathwaite and Walcott, and I must say that reading Brathwaite and Walcott, one is often given a story that is much more hopeful and positive. There is another side to thinking the sea. And that side comes from black feminists such as Christina Sharp and Tiffany King, who see the sea as doing something else. Tiffany King, for example, mobilizes the idea of shoals, the accumulation of granular material, sand, rocks, and material that through sedimentation creates a barrier for different things to pass. For King, thinking about shoals is to think about the lives and the theories, the intellectual work of black and indigenous scholars as they ask the question, where are our stories in the stories of modernity? Where are our stories when those museums were built? Black shoals for King is, she argues, that it pushes against a Western intellectual tradition that was constituted by and constitutive of slavery and genocide, and in order to enable something else to happen, another vision of the world to happen, that is divergent from what we have come to know and what our museums have been based on for a long time. On this account, to take black shoals, black and indigenous thought seriously, to take colonized lives seriously as shoals, we might need to tell other stories about the foundational assumptions that guide maritime histories. We might need to tell other stories about the Atlantic histories. And it is not about you, Michaela, and your new exhibition. I'm talking to Helen Mears here today because we shared a similar moment in the UK in the 2000s when at the moment of the celebration of the abolition of the slave trade in 2007, there were so many exhibitions going on. And there was at the same time, I think, an emergence of an Atlantic studies, an Atlantic history. And one was to ask, after all of that, whose stories were in these Atlantic histories? Were they still the narratives of the abolitionists, the saviors? Or were they in the narratives of those who had fought for their freedom, those who had a different understanding about what freedom could look like than the one that was given to them in the Western tradition? But if black feminists thought, or one of the things that I wanted to mention with the work of Tiffany, though, is that she speaks about what she calls a conquistador humanism. A conquistador humanism. That's the kind of humanism that says Columbus discovered the world. The conquest humanism that says that our maritime heroes must be the heroes of our nation, and not necessarily those other heroes who had to fight for their lives against our maritime heroes. What histories do we tell? I want to come to a close by looking at one other scholar, and perhaps one of the most beautifully written scholarship, difficult to read scholarship I find, but an amazing scholarship on the question of water and the watery. Sharp mobilized watery concepts of wake to think through the ways in which the afterlives of slavery continue to imperil certain lives in the present, whether or not it's through the killing by the police of black people in the US, or the death of black people in the Mediterranean, or people from outside Europe in the Mediterranean as they try to come to Europe from other places. Wake, according to Sharp, has multiple meanings. It is the track of water that surfaces by a ship. It is the disturbance caused when Wayne, am swimming in the pool or moving in water. Wake is a state of wakefulness. Wake is the recoil of, of guns as you hear the sound, what comes back at you. But wake, for Sharp, is also an attunement to the fact that in our world today, despite everything that we want to think about what is happening today, and this is what I call huggy decolonization. Huggy decolonization is to say, oh, we are doing so well. Oh, it is going so well. And the music, while outside our doors is death. Outside our borders is death. To account for wake, one needs to account for the hold of the slave ship as a site of death, but also the ways in which lives today, even if the slave ship isn't there anymore, are still left precarious. Sharp suggests that to live in the wake is to occupy, and to be occupied by the continuous and changing present of slavery as yet an unresolved unfolding. I have called that, in another paper that I was working on, the folding of time. So when we say things like, it is different now from then, or the moral whatever of today and the past, or nobody for today can be responsible for what happened previously, I would suggest to us all that most decolonial activists aren't expecting you to concern yourself with what happened in the past. They're rather suggesting that there is a folded time where precarities of the past live on in the present, and that we need to attend to the racism of the present. Dealing with the past can only be important if we are dealing with it to deal with the present. I'm interested in what, and Christina Sharp makes a suggestion, by the way. She calls it wake work. So I ask, and not because I don't know many of you, I will ask Michiel, what does wake work look like in this museum? What would it look like to organize our thinking around the sea, not only as life, but as death? And the fact that some bodies are easier dead than others, that some bodies are not as grievable as others. It is here that I want to close off to suggest that perhaps the museum as archive is a space for those stories. And my suggestion is not that because I know very often many people said to me when ICOM was trying to change their definition, they said to me, but that word entertainment needs to be in it because museums need to be happy places as well. That's true. I don't know that you have to tell me that entertainment must be in it for my museum to be happy though, but that's all right. But the stories that I'm interested in, the beautiful experiments of women, indigenous women, women of color, to try and tell us what freedom could look like when they were unfree, aren't sad stories. They aren't negative stories. They are joyous stories of how we can imagine different kind of futures in our museums. And I also do not want you to suggest that our museums should all only think about colonialism and whatever. I often get that criticism when I say these kind of things. To be honest, no. Because if it is one thing that I've learned, and I don't know how many of you do art history, if it is one thing that I've learned about the project of decolonization, a big part of it is indeed the critique of the infrastructure. But another part of it is just the simple acknowledgement that places that we've denied the possibility of having art. We say art is in Europe. I said I don't know how many do art because this is a critique. Every time we talk about global art histories, somebody says to me, oh, remember Magician de la Terre in 1989? Yeah, but there were other exhibitions, was in Havana, and perhaps in Australia, and perhaps wherever, that a global art history was happening before 1989. So perhaps what we need to be able to imagine as decolonial work, as decolonial joy, is also just simply giving credit and credibility to the idea that somewhere in Haiti, there was somebody who imagined what freedom could look like otherwise. And he or she or they were saying at that moment that the freedom that is being offered in this French Revolution might not be a freedom that takes me as human. And therefore, I am imagining a broader, more capacious understanding of freedom. That there for me is exciting and joyous. So I also want a museum that is happy. I want to go back to my mother, who didn't want me to go to the beach. Because I realized that perhaps I had been critical of my mother as I grew up. That my mother was not necessarily only afraid that I would drown, but rather that my mother was giving honor to the spirits that inhabit the sea. That she was saying there were ghosts there, ghosts of the past that we have not honored. She was saying that the African spirit, West African spirit of water, Yemaya, was there, and that story also needs to be honored. She was saying that to go to the sea, we cannot forget what the sea does in dividing us. And perhaps she wanted to imagine a sea that was more a space of bringing us together. My mother was worlding the sea. I wanted to close with this. And in closing, I hope that when you close this conference, because there's one of the biggest aspects of decolonial joy is for us all to get up and dance. So I hope you will organize a dance session. And the reason why I like dancing is that very often I love to dance, but I can't do it. So when you look at me, I am enjoying myself going on, and you think, what is he doing? But I'm in my own world. Perhaps we should attend to, by attending to these spirits, we will do, this is the work of Deborah Jack, an artist from St. Martin. And in this work, Deborah imagines the sea as an archive, a family archive, an archive of her own memory, but also a colonial archive of her relationship with the Netherlands and relationship with France, because the island is divided. So perhaps by taking the sea, not in the ways we sometimes do, but as memories, as archive, perhaps we will have something to say about climate change and climate justice. Perhaps we will have something to say about the vast number of people who are dying in the so-called migration crisis. Perhaps we will have something to say about even love and what it might mean to imagine that those people who were never regarded as humans in the past are lovable and that their lives are valuable. That for me is decolonization. And that for me is the promise that I think a Maritime Museum could offer us. Thank you.
Stay there. Ladies and gentlemen, we started a little bit late this morning, but I think Wayne has given us so much that is rich and to think about. I'm just going to beg your indulgence and offer 5 minutes for questions or comments on what he has said. Would anybody like to comment? And I've got a mic here if anybody does.
And I came from far, so you have to ask.
So you are being charged, including the people that are in the adjoining room. Any comments or questions? No, there is fine.
So for those of you who don't know me, I'm a retired admiral from the Brazilian Navy. I'm in charge of the Navy Heritage and Directorate Museum. And one of the biggest challenges I've got under my belt nowadays is to build a Maritime Museum in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. So we have a naval museum, and the Navy told me, you need to build a Maritime Museum. And I have a board of curators. First time we met, they all came to me and said, we want a Maritime Museum that is different from all the other different Maritime Museums that we have across the world, because all the other museums tell the story from a colonizer perspective. Countries that colonized other countries. And Brazil was colonized. So we want a museum from a colonized country's perspective. So your presentation resonates a lot with what the Board of Curators told me. And they want to talk about Iemanjá, which you talked about, a religious, important figure for the black community in Brazil especially, but for other communities as well across the country. And in the last 3 days, I've been hearing a lot different stories here, which are very important for me to be able to gather all this information and take it back to the Board of Curators. Hopefully we'll have, by the end of the Ocean Decade, a good Maritime Museum in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, that you can all benefit from visiting in the near future. But what I wanted to talk about, really, is a bit of understanding how the different stories should correlate. I mean, not having just one story, but different stories being told in the museum. So I've heard about how some museums are trying to change a little bit their perspective and talk about decolonizing their own exhibits, but in the sense that it looks like sometimes they try to erase and push it under the carpet, and that's not the point, right? You want to be able to highlight what happened in history, and also to be able to give voice to those that, as you said, have not had the chance to be heard in the past. So I would like you to maybe talk a little bit about this. This looks like a dichotomy, really, when you're trying to do something to show the world that you're pushing towards a more decolonized museum, but on perhaps you're doing something that is actually trying to erase that history, that significant part of the history. So please.
Yeah. All right, thank you for that. Just one note. When I worked in Jamaica, I was also in charge of one museum that was a maritime-ish museum. It was in Port Royal. And why I wanted to say that is that in Jamaica, the anthropology that I grew up with was a decolonized anthropology. And still, the museum that I inherited and I was working at, that museum for a long time also told the story of Britain. So even in the independence moment when I left was in 2007, what I'm trying to say that even colonized spaces tell colonized stories. So you don't have to be having been formally colonized, don't necessarily assure that you're going to tell decolonial stories, because it is a way of thinking that we've inhabited. It is, all of us are a part of this way of thinking. I grew up in schools thinking about Christopher Columbus. That's how I grew up. I got up every morning and talk about when he came. So that happens as well. For me, one of the things that has happened recently in the decolonization trajectory is a conversation around multiple perspectives. And I think that I am convinced, believe in multi-perspective, but sometimes we underestimate the challenge of what that means. Because there are some perspectives, perhaps, that we might not want to tell. There are some perspectives, perhaps, that need to be told differently. So an appeal to multiple perspectives is not always an easy answer to the question that we have. And I always give the example that nobody will disagree with me about. There was a time, as a man, I could have written a story in a museum that was male and very celebratory of the male as having conquered the world, knowing everything, whatever. That story is not to be told anymore for two reasons. It should not be, and the other one is more women work in museums anyway, so it won't be told. But so I think that we should be cautious when we think of what that might mean, and it does not mean that you're not going to tell the perspective of the quote-unquote colonizer. The question is, what approach do you take to that story? Is it possible to tell that story with also telling the fact that, yeah, saying that colonialism was evil or bad isn't saying that the people or whomever is evil and bad. You're saying that there was a system in place that continues to do our work, and that is what you're addressing. So for me, there is a way to tell these stories, but what we have to agree to is that not all perspectives must be told, and two, that in telling those perspectives, the question is, are you committed to a horizon, for me, of justice and equity? And that, for me, for us in our museum, is something that is very important.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll have to, unfortunately, call it to a halt here so that we can move on to the rest of the session. Will you join with me in thanking Wayne for his wonderful presentation?
Thank you.